Hi, my name is Leslie Terebesi, and this is video number 4 in a series on the question of how Islam became political. Before we proceed to the main part of the video, let us briefly recap what went before. We have already covered the first three of the 6 stages in which the Islam as a religion of peace was basically transformed into what we call political Islam or Islamism. Now, the first stage, you will recall, was the repression of reason, a development that arose out of the squabbles between the so-called rationalists, the Ahlil al-Ra'i in Arabic, and the traditionists, or the Ahlil al-Hadith, as the Arabic expression goes. So now, as a result of this repression of reason, two developments followed. The first was that the exegetes began to encounter verses in the Quran that struck them as ambiguous, and secondly, they began to encounter verses in the Quran that struck them as contradictory. Now, in order to deal with the first challenge that presented by verses that struck the exegetes as ambiguous, basically the exegetes did not attempt to use their reason as perhaps we would think they would try. Rather, they reached out to tradition in the conviction that tradition provided a better source of interpretation and understanding than reason. So that was the first response. The second response, and this response will be investigated in a separate video, was to have recourse to the so-called Doctrine of Abrogation in order to deal with the challenge presented by what appeared to them as contradictory verses. In this approach, verses that were revealed earlier would be considered to have been abrogated by verses that were revealed later. But in any case, in order to have recourse to tradition, the exegetes first had to elevate tradition to the rank of revelation because of the presence of 3 verses in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verses 44, 45, and 47, which say that anyone who judges by something that Allah did not reveal is a zalim, a wrongdoer, a kafir, a disbeliever, and a fasik, or a rebel. So the exegetes that wanted to use tradition to explain, or in other words to judge revelation, needed to elevate tradition to the rank of revelation first, otherwise they would not have been able to use tradition, so to speak, to judge revelation. So this is how the second stage in the process of the 6 stages or waves transpired. The second stage was basically the elevation of tradition to revelation. Now the third stage, as we have seen, was the actual practice of judging a revelation by tradition. Now this brings us to the fourth stage, which went even beyond the third stage, because it elevated tradition to a level yet higher than before. And this elevation consisted of designating or accepting the principle that tradition is not only equal to revelation, that tradition is not only a judge of revelation, but, and this is the principle that I'm coming to, that tradition is even able to abrogate or cancel revelation. So this was the fourth development, or the fourth stage in the 6 stages that actually led to the transformation of the religion of peace into Islamism or political Islam. So now, how did this abrogation work? The doctrine of abrogation, first of all, is completely alien to the Qur'an. The Quran says in 3 separate verses that we will never find a change in the words of Allah. The references to these verses can be found in the text written below. So now, abrogation actually takes several forms, but its 3 main forms are the abrogation of revelation by revelation, the abrogation of revelation by tradition, and thirdly, the abrogation of the prior revelations recorded in the Torah and the Injil by the final revelation or final testament, the Qur'an. So we need to look at these three types of abrogation, and what I would like to suggest, first of all, that these three types of abrogations were in fact rejected by nearly all contemporary commentators, who include Fazlur Rahman, Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida, Muhammad Asad, Ismail Faruqi, Taha Jabir Alwani, and from the old days it also includes a fellow called Abu Muslim al-Isfahani. So in other words, the doctrine of abrogation does not find very much support in the contemporary commentaries on the Quran. However, in the classical days, beginning from the year 660, according to Taha Jabir Alwani, who also rejected the doctrine of abrogation, starting from the year 660, the majority of the ulema have actually accepted the doctrine of abrogation, and they accepted abrogation even of a Quranic verse by a solitary hadith. And by the way, this was not a minority opinion, this was a majority opinion. So now, as we will see in the later videos, it was on the basis of the doctrine of abrogation that its supporters, the supporters of the doctrine of abrogation, declared all 120 so-called peace verses to have been abrogated by a solitary verse, the so-called verse of the sword. And this view is actually also expressed, recounted, and actually condemned and rejected by another contemporary commentator, and his name is Muhammad Ghazali, who was a sheikh of Al-Azhar, and he also wrote an interesting book of tafsir called Themes of the Quran. So now this abrogation of the peace verses by the Ayah Saif essentially paved the way for the transformation of the religion of peace into something a little more aggressive, or even perhaps we can say militant, something that we refer to as political Islam or Islamism. Now, in terms of the abrogation of the previous revelations by the final revelation of the Quran, this doctrine is also misleading and misplaced, because the Quran says, in fact, in no fewer than 20 verses, that this final revelation of the Quran actually confirms rather than abrogates the previous revelations, which were recorded more or less accurately in the written scriptures known as the Torah and the Injil. So now there is also a doctrine, part of the doctrine of abrogation is made up of the teaching that, as I mentioned earlier, even a hadith and even a solitary hadith can abrogate a Quranic verse. And I will give one example of that. Just as we had in the abrogation of the peace verses of the Quran by the so-called verse of the sword, also found in the Quran, we have in addition something that we can think of as the abrogation of a Quranic verse by tradition. And the tradition I am referring to is the well-known tradition, which was, by the way, a favorite of al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, active in Iraq recently. And this tradition allegedly says that, I quote, as accurately as I recall, this tradition says, "God bless Prophet Muhammad, who was sent with the sword as a mercy to all mankind." End of quote. So now notice the presence of this one interesting word in this hadith, and that word is the word sword, or as-saif in Arabic. The people, viewers familiar with the Quran will recall that there's a verse that sounds very similar to this particular hadith, and that the verse is found in Surah 21, verse 107, where Allah Ta'ala declares that in Arabic, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That means we have not sent you except as a mercy to all the worlds. Now notice that this verse has absolutely no reference to the sword, unlike the Hadith. But in every other respect it sounds very, very similar. And this is what I mean by the abrogation, or even perhaps we can say a replacement for all practical purposes, of a Quranic verse by a hadith that it has been politicized and that has a distinct militant tenor to it. So these two types of abrogation, actually all three in some ways, have contributed or paved the way for the transformation of the religion of peace into political Islam that actually endorses a form of aggressive jihad known as Jihad Al-Talab, which is not mentioned in the Quran and definitely not endorsed by the Quran either. While the Quran permits and even requires fighting, it does so only in the context of self-defense. But what the ulama have done by adding the so-called sixth pillar of Islam, the requirement to participate in jihad every year and once a year, what they have done by this, by adopting and proclaiming this principle, they have basically transformed, as I mentioned, the religion of peace into a religion, I am tempted to say war. Of course, Islam is a religion of peace, but it was the explanation of the ulama that have transformed its teaching into a rationale for waging wars of expansion and conquest to satisfy the ambitions and the agenda of the powers that be at the time. So this is basically how the process worked. Now finally the abrogation of the previous revelations by the final revelation also participated to some extent in this project, because it cast the followers of the previous revelations, as some of the ulama have cast them, as kafirs or disbelievers, while there is no evidence for this kind of characterization of the people book in the Quran whatsoever. Yes, the Quran does on some occasion refer to some of the people of the book. I repeat, to some of the people of the book as disbelievers, but never to all of the people of the book. So here is another example of carelessness on the basis, on a part of some of the exegetes, in the way they interpreted, or rather misinterpreted, the Quran. So this was basically what we are saying about how the fourth stage of the process in which the religion of peace that we know as Islam has been transformed into a kind of ideology or rationale for waging wars of expansion of the so-called realm of peace, the Darul Islam, at the expense of the so-called Darul Harb, or the realm of war, in a kind of articulation of reality that actually is very reminiscent, is very it calls to mind the so-called clash of civilizations thesis that was recently articulated in the Western world by none other than Samuel Huntington. So there are some interesting parallels here, but in any case, this concludes the current video, and in the coming video we are going to be looking at how, at the next stage of the transformation of the religion of peace into political Islam took place, and that will be the stage in which rulings based on the word of God, Allah, in the Quran, have been effectively not merely abrogated but even replaced by rulings based on the traditions. Thank you very much.